Hey, welcome to X-Oriente, the new voice of Brotherhood. I am half of your host, Eric Diamond.
I'm the other half, Jason Van Dyke, and we leave it to you to decide which half is the front, etc. Go ahead. Sorry.
And we have a special guest tonight. He is worshipful brother Robert H. Johnson, who is he is one of the hosts of the Masonic Roundtable, and he also has his own fantastic podcast, the Whence Came You podcast. Hi, Robert.
Well, hello there, fellas, and everybody out there.
Hey. And what are your Masonic credentials?
Masonic credentials.
Yeah,
worship. Yeah. Past master of my home lodge, Waukegan 78. I'm a current sitting secretary of Space Novum 1183 under dispensation. I'm a past district education officer in the state of Illinois and a past district deputy grand master also in the state of Illinois. And then I'm just a regular member in a couple other foreign jurisdictions.
Cool.
Yeah.
Like foreign, like outside the United States, or foreign outside of Illinois?
Yeah, so I have one additional lodge outside the U.S., which is Internet Lodge, right? UGLE.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
And then Attleboro, Massachusetts, we have Ezekiel Bates.
Cool. Awesome. So, let's see. A couple things going on in Masonic news that kind of dovetails into our topic tonight. One of them was this happened. I think it was reported on last weekend on the Masonic Reuters service, which is Chris Hodap's blog, Freemasons for Dummies.
Right.
And so I guess what happened was that the past Grand Master of Georgia sort of up and left, seemingly suddenly, and basically kind of, issued a statement, covered in stamps and notary seals and things like that, that basically he now felt that Masonry was incompatible with his Christian faith, and so he's leaving the fraternity. And that sparked a lot of conversation on social media. With sort of the predictable, like what you would think would be the commentary on social media, which we're not going to really delve into. But what I thought was really interesting was kind of why he did that. And I think the prevailing opinion that I was able to kind of pull out of from the commentary on social media was that here was a guy who tried to make Freemasonry into something that it wasn't supposed to be, which is something that reflected sectarian religious values. And when that didn't kind of pan out for him, he just kind of said, well, okay, then I'll take my toys and go home. Am I reading that wrong? I mean, is that jibing with what you guys have been?
That smells about right to me. I mean, honestly, I think that's probably to a large extent exactly what happened. Is that he tried to he tried to push Masonry in a direction that more reflected his personal religious beliefs, and those personal religious beliefs, at least in part, didn't match completely with the majority of the brethren in that grand jurisdiction. And I think that he got to a point where he just said, okay, well, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's interesting. I mean, obviously, if you leave Masonry, you can leave. Bye.
Right. You could just leave. You can leave quietly, and yeah.
Just go away. I don't answer my phone anymore. I'm not a Mason. And but he wrote a letter, had it notarized. Probably had it hung up in his church. Point of pride. I don't know.
I'm not condemning it. I'm just, I'm just saying.
No, I'm just saying that, to me, it rang a little strange. That's all. Like, you could just walk away.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, when I read about it, it felt like, to your point, Jason, you're going to do all this work, like to make it known that you did this. You do that specifically because, it's your Jerry Maguire moment. It's who's coming with me. Mm-hmm. It's, I'm laying my case out. If I have just convinced you, great. And
but
it's a middle finger to everybody out there.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
The middle finger to everybody else. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really good way to say, I don't trust myself, so I've got to make sure that I burn that bridge to ashes behind me.
I mean, you may be right there, right? Like,
you know what I'm saying? Like, you just never know. And so the thing is that one way to make sure you're never going to come back and that you will not have the friends that you had before. Yep.
Right. And what's interesting about that whole situation is that, as you mentioned, he tried to maybe make Masonry in his, sectarian viewpoint, but we see that in politics all day. That's where people grab their, what they want the world to be, or the laws they want to follow, right? That's what they push, and they push out there. But the problem is that just doesn't work in Freemasonry. And I guess it would normally work, right? Because it is a benevolent dictatorship, right?
Totally.
But the constituency of Masonic lodges is like, nope, you are unpopular.
Right.
And maybe this would have been totally fine 30 years ago, pre-internet.
Sure.
Because nobody's like, oh, can you believe the Grand Master's doing all this?
Right.
And now today we've, like you called Hodep, the Reuters of Freemasonry.
Right, exactly.
It's so good.
It is. What's interesting too, Robert, is that like going more on that is that it is a benevolent dictatorship, right? And maybe 30 years ago, and I actually I have no idea if one guy could really push the fraternity in one direction, and it would stay like that. But these days, it's just it's a benevolent dictatorship for 1 year, and then there's a new dictator, and so there is very little consistency on a good day on something that all the lodges agree about, and so.
You've got zero continuity too. Like every Grand Master seems to have they want to have their time at bat, and show you what you got. And they're going to take the 3 swings.
Yep, exactly. Right.
You're not gonna. It was an unfortunate situation. I felt bad reading a lot of the comments because, as Eric, you pointed out, you think how that kind of thing goes, right? If anybody who takes a stand and anybody, you see this in Masonic literature all the time, anybody who takes it, there's a really large objective lens on everything. Nobody wants to clearly define anything because nobody wants to get crapped on. And the second you get really acute on something, like for instance in this guy's case, he got dumped on quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So which kind of brings us around to this topic, and the topic today is kind of sparked by an essay that you wrote, Robert. It was published in the on Nick Johnson's blog, the Millennial Freemason. And
please state for the record if there's any relation in Johnson's.
No record whatsoever.
No familial relations.
I mean, I found out today, though, that my Ancestry.com is they increased the percentages of where my DNA is from. So, as I understand it, he's quite Scandinavian, and I've got like 2% Scandinavian. So maybe way back.
Okay. No, that's totally fair. That's totally fair. Right,
with Sven the Horrible.
That's good. That's good.
When he was rampaging through Europe. Yeah.
These are important disclosures, Robert. This is for. It's for posterity.
But so anyway, so you wrote this essay, which we'll talk about. But then also the TMR guys did a show just this past Thursday about relevancy. And I have to say, like, I really enjoy listening to the Masonic Roundtable. But in this case, when I was listening to this show, I was like cringing inside. I was cringing because what the topic of the show was is Masonry relevant? And I think they were really struggling to answer that question. And I don't think they ever really answered it in the show, right? I think what they answered is Freemasonry valuable, right? And to that I would say absolutely, right? The Freemasonry is needed by the world more than it ever has been, but relevant? Don't know, you know? In fact, if I had to, like, you know, based on my professional, you know, like what I do in advertising for a living, right? Which is sort of take brands like, you know, cheese crackers and cereal and electronics and insurance and make it relevant to people and make it so that they want to associate with those brands. And I can tell you, based on the criteria that I have to use in my job, no, Masonry is not relevant, right? And it's a hard thing to hear.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree. I think the largest point of contention, well, let's back up to that TMR episode. When you ask, is Freemasonry relevant? I think Jason was one of the last folks to say at the end in his final thoughts something like, there was a qualifier, maybe, or an if. And there is that element that we're constantly fighting. Like, I understand if anybody on TMR, if we never said, I'll have to listen to it again, but if nobody ever took a stance and said yes or no, it has to be because it hurts. It hurts to either lie about it or to say the truth.
Yeah, right.
And what I think is really hard there is, like you said, Eric. Are we relevant, and how do we stay relevant? But then the opposition to this, when we put that hard data in front of somebody and say, "Here it is. This is everything, and this says that we're not checking all these boxes to be relevant." If you could somehow identify those same things that we would say, identify something as relevant in any period in time, you could probably line it up and go, yeah, this was great. Like when we had the membership boom, something that was wonderful is the fact that we had an intersection of relevancy, right? Like social equality and social time, and that was fashionable. And so we had that intersection there, and so it was kind of relevant, but that's not today. And when we point anything out, the flip side of the coin, right, or anybody who's in opposition would say, that's what Masonry is about, is we have a tradition. We don't need to change to the demands of the outside world. And that's frustrating for me. And I understand there's a lot of guys out there who think that my point of view on that is idiotic or whatever, and that's okay. I'm all right with that. But I just feel like, and when I'm at work, and I had a mentee at work, and he asked about it, and I kind of pitched. I gave him the soft pitch, right? Like my pitch is always like, it's a cool fraternity. There's a lot of whatever. I give him like this soft approach, and he's like, wow. And I said, would you ever be interested in that? And he's like, no.
Ouch.
I said, well, let me ask, what turns you off to this? And his answers are like, cause he's way younger than me, so he's like in his 20s, and I'm 38 or 37. And he said, I think that's really kind of weird that women are excluded. I think it's really weird that like it's very inexpensive and like, what could you possibly get for this, or whatever this stuff was. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. And I remember going back to my notebook, and I just kind of wrote that stuff down. It's like, I need to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
The relevancy for, like, you can't be about membership and want to be about membership without caring about a topic like a target audience.
Right. So, all right. So let's get. So you wrote this article, and I have to tell you, I've read a lot of articles about Freemasonry, and this article I think is one of the most important things that have been written about the fraternity in the last 15 years. Right? You probably weren't expecting me to say that, but I think it is.
I've gotten so much. I've gotten a lot of pushback on the article. Yeah, I appreciate the sentiment.
So the title of the article is "The Problem with Banning Politics and Religion," which is essentially jumping on the third rail, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Pretty much.
And so tell me, before we get into like what the article is about, what prompted you to write this article?
So the prompt essentially was that when we sit in lodge, I see a lot on social media. Particularly, we'll see people of Masonic authority, I'm not going to say anything else, post things that seem egregious in terms of whether it's religious or political opinion. And they post it, and there are so many men out there who get banned from a Grand Lodge page or get a talking to for making a mention of something online. And yet certain religious and political ideologies, when expressed online, don't matter if it's the right kind. And I got to thinking about this, and I then on Whence Came You, the program that I do, is there was a 3 or a 4-part episode that we did on the Grand Lodge. Is it National de France? The one that's not recognized, right?
The Grand Lodge. Well, there's the Grand Orient, which is the
Grand
they're
Orient.
irregular, but then the Grand Lodge of France is regular but not recognized.
Grand Lodge National.
No, Grand Lodge National is recognized.
Correct. Yeah,
and
that's
is
a good one. The Grand Orient.
It's the other one because basically
the
they took the volume of sacred law off the altar, and they said that men should be like your conscience is overall.
Yeah. Right. That's the Grand Orient.
Yeah. So I was reading about this on the program, and one of the things I thought was striking was the fact that in the time this was written, they were talking about some of the things that their Grand Lodge covers at Grand Lodge sessions, and some of those topics are things like the plight of the modern woman the safety of workers working in the towns or whatever. And it's really interesting. They bring this up at Grand Lodge. They discuss some solutions. They send their people back to their lodges, and they say, work in your communities to fix these things or to discuss them more. And I thought, wow, that's really progressive. And it's really interesting when we hear about, one of the things I always heard as a Mason in the beginning was, we make the world a better place. We want to leave it a better place than we came into it. And and I always thought, like, well, how are we doing that? Maybe that is just through one Mason at a time, learning to better himself and going out and making an impact. But then, like, as a fraternity, what does that look like? And then you start reading about a lot of, revolutionary heroes. Sam Adams, who was a huge in his caucus work, protecting the rights and social programs of Boston's middle class citizens. Mm-hmm. And their lower middle class citizens, and just protecting social values for these people. And so people will say, well, I don't think Freemasonry has any business in social reforms or whatever, or whatever you want to call that. I say, well, maybe we didn't, and maybe that's not our original intent, but that's the last great thing that we're known for, and we've dropped off. And I thought about this, and I said, well, why don't we do this anymore? And it goes back to what we were just talking about with this Grand Master, right? You have a religious ideology that you attempt to insert into your political ideologies. Mm-hmm. And so now you have religion and politics that are intertwined and completely inseparable, especially now in politics. We either have, liberal atheists or conservative right-wing evangelists, or whatever you want to call them. There seems to be no in between. You couldn't convince anybody otherwise. And because of this intertwining, I basically said, well, you can never actually do social reform in a lodge anymore. And I started thinking about etymology and what words mean. And Scott Duvall is a worshipful master of our new lodge, Space Novum. He's also a state education officer for the state of Illinois. And he did this great presentation one day where he discussed the topic of Masonic justice. When we talk about justice in Masonry, almost everybody just jumps on this like eye for an eye biblical kick, or this idea of justice in terms of the law. But really, the term justice Masonically is the equality of man. It is this idea of true brotherhood. That is, justice is on the level. That's what this is. And so when we look at that, and I looked at the words progressive moral science, it really comes down to what I believe, just looking at basic etymology says when those words were written and when they were documented and used in this time, it really should mean social reforms. And if we're anything, if we're a progressive moral society of social reforms, then we need to do that. But we can't do that because government does that. And we can't bring government into lodge. So we either have to stop using the term progressive moral science, or we have to teach the trivium and teach men how to, act proper. We were in the green room. Eric, I hope you don't mind to mention this, but you were telling me of some of your amazing 4-hour debates between you and another brother that I know, and on totally opposite sides of the political spectrum, yet you share a room and you guys don't kill each other. Like, it's a sign of two educated dudes, coming together to discuss, and maybe there's no solutions, right? But it's important that you be able to do that. And so that's really the basis of the paper and why I wrote it. I felt that there just should be a call to either teach people how to act appropriately, and if we can do that, then you have no fear of bringing outside, talking into lodge. Some guys thought I meant into the ante room, and I was like, well, that's kind of softening it, but I really think you should be able to just talk about those things in a lodge.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that the reason that my brother and I don't kill each other is it would be very difficult to explain to the housekeeping staff. But so let's get into the paper a little bit. So that you say that you start out by saying that we don't discuss politics and religion, and the hope is that by adhering to these rules that we create a unified organization, right? And I think that's true, and I see it a lot on social media, where if someone talks about anything that is the least bit controversial, then it's like, well, we can't talk about these things because we have to stay united. And that strikes me as like, parents that are disagreeing and bickering and say, well, we can't disagree because we have to present a united front to the children, right? And it doesn't mean you don't discuss these things. It means maybe it means you don't discuss them in front of the kids, because you might scare them, right? But it doesn't mean that you don't. And I think when you don't discuss it, that's when a marriage, which is, it's not a brotherhood, but it's a family relationship. That's when it starts to fester, right? You start to get these sort of
yeah. Well, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And so if you're not doing this, you fill it with whatever your head says, and 9 times out of 10, your head is going to give you the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
So, for me at least, what you're talking about, and I think, Robert, what you're talking about too, is that essentially what it boils down to we can talk about anything. We can really get into anything as long as it's done with respect. and as long as it's done with an appreciation, a minimum of an appreciation that someone may hold a totally opposite view of something that you hold near and dear. And that's okay. It's coming to grips with that, right? And that you're not going to convince them otherwise. It's just how that's going to go. So you can take, two paths. One, attempt to understand where they're coming from to form a greater understanding of the world around you, or just don't talk about it, move on to something else. But I would hope that it would be number one, because number one is actually what makes you a better man. Because again, you're attempting to understand the world around you better. And I'm just going to go ahead and say it. For those in the audience who don't know it, the world does not revolve around you. It happens that, there's a whole lot that, regardless of your existence, just happens. And I think it's a tough existential question to get to for some people. But if you hammer at this issue, and what you're talking about, I think it's right to the heart of it. It's right to the heart of that. So and then here's the next part about it. And you say it in here, and I was scrolling around trying to find the exact sentence you said, and it's towards the beginning, but I couldn't find it right away. You nonchalantly say, it's hard. It's the biggest understatement in the entire paper. Yeah, it's hard. It's super hard. This is really difficult. Like, this is a struggle that mankind has been having with itself for a really long time. We're not just confronting it now. They used to fight.
The issue that I see consistently is an inability to admit when something is hard and when somebody needs help with something, or when you don't need something. And I talked about that too.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's it.
I just don't think it's okay to say something's hard. Like we talked about in the beginning, like admitting something, it hurts. Yeah. So we don't even want to mention it. How many times, I don't know you guys, if you have kids, my kids have asked me, Dad, what's the worst thing you've ever done? And gosh, I'm like, man, all right, let me think about PG stuff and give you the worst thing I've ever done. When I asked my granddad that,
awesome. Really?
My grandfather told me, he said,
I killed a man just for snoring.
I wish he said that. You know what he told
just
me?
To watch him die.
He said, I climbed a tree in my church clothes. I was like 13 when I asked him, and I said, holy cow, like, you were in the Navy. That's definitely not the worst thing you've ever done.
Yeah.
But when I think about it, it's like, yeah, it's hard, and it's okay to say something is hard, but so many times guys don't want to do that. And what I think also, and this is sometimes what I'm not an elitist per se, but I do think that, of course, we have run amok letting anybody join the fraternity. I love the quote, and it doesn't, if you want to call me as saying that, I'm quoting it out of context, I'm not. It's a book called The Master's Lectures. Is it right here?
There you go. Uh-huh.
Okay. So there's a chapter on fraternity, and it just says, trooping through the doors of our preparation rooms, we find an ever-increasing company composed of those from whose faces is missing the stamp of high intelligence, in whose eyes the torch of education has lighted no fires, and whose halting steps are led by friendly suggestions or quickened by the hope of gain.
That was on Twitter. That's no way anybody wrote that into a book. That's Twitter. That's amazing.
1923. It's a fantastic book, and of course there are things inside of it that I don't agree with. But I thought, how insane is that statement? He's saying we let dudes in who don't meet our qualifications, and this is relevant because I think a qualification for Masonry should be that you should be able to have these conversations.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, just okay. So this is just my gut reaction right now. I haven't taken zero time to actually think this through, but I'm just going to gut react it because that's what I do. Here's the thing: I don't know if I agree with that because I think that as long as you're open to the idea that you want to grow into that, I'll let you in the door because I want to teach you to do that, and I want to have another person in the world that wasn't there before doing it. I want another one, so I'll take you any day as long as you're willing to put the work in order to get to that level.
Well, but I think what he's saying is the person who has the capability to do that, not necessarily the mastery or the.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Jason. I think in that statement, if we know somebody, when you say the spark of education has lighted no fires,
yeah, right.
Somebody who's not excited to learn is not somebody that I would want coming into lodge. I really wouldn't want somebody coming into our fraternity because it's a place. It's
something to do.
I'm going to use a way all too popular critique. I don't want you coming to lodge just to go to the shrine. That's not okay. Right. And I think everybody agrees on that.
And I appreciate that because hopefully I took it in the pejorative that it was meant to be. So thank you. Yeah.
So interestingly,
on the shrine.
When you say you said the apprehension, fear, and trepidation we have as a society in terms of the discussion of the discussion of our ideologies and other beliefs stems from some simple shortcomings. And my question is that when we're talking about those ideologies, are they necessarily political ideologies, religious ideologies, or moral ideologies? Right? And this is an important point because not everything in morality is derived from Scripture. Right? And I think that's one of the foundations that speculative Masonry at least as a fraternity was kind of founded on. Right?
Yeah, I think that's 100% relevant to say, but also at the same time, within our fraternity, I think you would find that the majority of men would tell you that without a religion, you cannot have codified morality. Like, there's so many dudes that do not see it that way. Like, I'm a deist, so I don't particularly agree with the fact that, like, the 10 Commandments don't need to be at the court. And I think that too many people might think that should be the case, or that's where we pull our morals and our laws from, and then that influences the political.
I think that's a problem because if you look at the history of philosophy, right, it really starts with Baruch Spinoza in the 1600s, right? And Spinoza was the first philosopher to really start to kind of think about the rights of an individual. Up until that point, like, the idea of personal rights was just non-existent, right? Like, you did morality was derived from Scripture and from God, and that was that, and power derived from God, right? And that was that. And it wasn't until the 1600s when, guys started saying, well, wait a minute, maybe there's value in the individual, and maybe that person has rights and that those things need to be protected. And then it's kind of a short jump into sort of the John Locke territory where we start to say, that no, power doesn't derive from God. Power derives from the consent of the governed, right? Mm-hmm. And then you get to the Declaration of Independence, which itself is an argument. It's a logical argument. The entire document is nothing but an argument. Yeah. And it's an argument that's saying that, like yes, we're endowed with these certain rights that are inalienable, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And that government is there to protect those rights. And as soon as it stops doing that, we have a we have the power and the obligation to change the government. And that's why this is so revolutionary, right? Is it because they weren't pointing to scripture and saying, "Oh, well, it says right here in Kings 2 that blah blah blah." No. That was, basically Saul fell out of favor with God, and Saul was out and David was in, and then David was out and Solomon was in, and then Solomon was out. And it's like that. That's how politics went in those days, right? And all of a sudden, here we have these guys, many of whom are Masons, right, saying, maybe there's a morality that's based on reason and rationality, and it's not based on religion, right? And that we can reason our way into a system of governance and a way to sort of regard and treat each other. And I think that's what enabled. I think that was sort of the gift that Freemasonry gave to the emergence of modern democracy, right? Was this sort of idea that it doesn't have to be everybody is the same religion. We can all be different religions as long as we agree that there are these certain things that all religions promise. Yeah. And from there, we can then use reason to get to where we need to go.
Yeah, I think it's important, too, that when we think about this, and for anybody out there who maybe not agree or not, maybe they're on the fence, is that if we could sit down and say, well, I really feel, so you have to predicate all of this on being open and honest and unafraid of admitting vulnerabilities and admitting
shortcomings.
Yeah, exactly. So I should say, listen, I feel really self-conscious and weird about letting you, let's say, about letting you, let's go back to the 90s, assists with somebody's suicide. I feel that's really hard on my spiritual beliefs. How do you justify that? But we don't do that. We just say, that's wrong. Here's my argument.
Right.
And so when we sit down and we can go back and forth and say, well, where is that common ground? Where do we come together? I think it's really important to be able to do that. And I don't know, Thomas Paine he's got a really good book. His Freemason book is not so great, but yeah. Paine has a really good job in The Rights of Man and also The Age of Reason is a pretty decent argument for a lot of things.
Yeah. So
I couldn't agree more.
Mike Hambrick is in the chat room, and he said, "Have you thought religion wasn't originally meant to create cultish worship, but to provide a means of teaching morality?" Originally, I would say no. I would say if you look at how religion was practiced, 1,300, 1,500 years ago, even further back. I mean, the idea of morality develops later. And you only have to read Leviticus to see that. It's you have a sin offering and you've got a daily offering and you've got a
religion was government.
Yeah, pretty much.
And so,
I feel like the religious element in the beginning, right, is always been a means of power, submission. How can I gain?
It's a means. On the other side of it, it's a means of order.
Yeah, precisely. I think that also we see this buildup over time, though. It becomes this idea of morality, and it does that because people start thinking, and people say, "Well, it shouldn't be this way, right? I'm a person too," and then that idea gets popular, and then a religious organization has to change, or adapt, or become irrelevant. We've seen so much happen. The last two popes, right? Things that they've said that people have lost I have never seen so many people lose their minds on some things that the most recent pope has said. And Like, I'm just like, wow. I think the current Dalai Lama, it's misquoted all the time, and it's taken out of context. But there's something there. He says, to paraphrase it and butcher it even more than it already has been, is if science disproves something that Buddhism believes, Buddhism has to change. He's just real upfront about it. He's like, yeah, like we have to amend how we think about something if it's been proven to be false. I think that's pretty neat.
Mm-hmm. So you say you said the next part of your paper talks about addressing our vulnerabilities, and you say that we have an inability to admit vulnerability to our peers. And so my question is how did we get here? How is it that saying the words "I don't know," when did that become weakness rather than strength?
I don't know.
Well played, sir.
Yeah.
Wrap it
I
up.
don't know. I was. I remember a conversation I had with my dad. It was probably, I don't know. I had to have been a little guy, under 10. And I asked him a simple question. I was eating a bowl of strawberries and I said, "Dad, why do strawberries have the seeds on the outside?" And he was talking to his buddy and he took a swig of his beer and he looked at me and he goes, "That's a good question, son." Anyway, Ted, and I asked him again years later, and I got the same response. I later found the answer by watching an episode of Diego with my son. But it's this idea that if you don't know, you're somehow unintelligent, or you're giving up some sort of power over somebody else. I don't know if you've ever known somebody who is the greatest BS artist in the world, and you could ask a question, and then they've always got an answer. You've never heard this guy say, "I don't know." We all know somebody like that. I have to teach my son now, who's 12. I say, son, you don't always have to be right. Just say, "I don't know." Right? Because I'll be saying, like, "Don't say that because that's not true." And he's like, "Yeah, I know. But you just said it." "Yeah, I know. You're just nothing. Just admit you're wrong. Like, we're learning together. This is okay." I would much rather learn together and grow together than for you to feel like you have to, bump chests with Dad and like, I'm right. And, I'm going to tell you if you're right.
Yeah, I think it's partially from that our society, especially, contemporary American society, we value almost over everything else right now, genius, right? The genius is, our deity today. And that genius, that archetype of the genius is generally never wrong, always one step ahead, always clever, always, doing something bigger and better. Elon Musk is a perfect example of someone who is kind of anointed with this genius, right? And so he gets on Twitter and he's high most of the time, and he'll just tweet stupid stuff out, and people are like, "Oh, mind blowing," Well, when does Elon Musk, when you ask him something, does he go, "I don't know"? And if he does, generally it's probably, I asked you a question and you kind of went, "I kind of don't." He might say, "I kind of don't know," but he never says it out loud, and then he just makes a flamethrower. The thing is that
there's nothing wrong with, though, and I think too, is to say, "I don't know, but let's speculate on this. Here's what I feel."
"I don't know, let me take a stab in the dark at it, and I'm going to throw this against the wall and see if it sticks," right? But as long as you preface it with that, right? Like, I have no basis at all for this to be reality, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. How about this? and I'm okay with that too. It's like it almost feels like the trope of how a man can never ask for directions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's hilarious because that's just not me. That never has been me. Of the, "I won't give up. I'll never ask for help. I'm totally cool with going up to a stranger and being like, I have no idea what's going on here. Please help me. Because I know that that's how you actually get help, and that's how you learn something new. That's how you move yourself forward in life. It's not by continually slamming your head into a wall. You
Yeah,
know?
I think a long time ago, I'll admit that probably 5 or 6 years ago, I used to listen to the Adam Carolla podcast quite a bit. And one of the things that he had said that it stuck with me was when he was a carpenter, some guy walked up to him and was like, "Hey, you're kind of doing this in a weird way. You mind if I show you how to do this a better way?" And he was like, "Nah, get the hell out of here. I'll do it myself." And he's like, in my old age, I was trying to teach my friend's son how to snap a football. And I said, "Hey, you mind if I show you a pointer?" The kid was like, "Yeah, okay." He's like, "Why didn't I just do that? Why didn't I just say okay and learn?" Even if it sucked, I was being nice. And what's the chances? Maybe I'll learn something.
What's really interesting about that is that kids are way more. They're faster to do that, to say, yeah, sure, show me. Whereas as soon as you hit, adulthood, you're in college. All of a sudden, I remember having a teacher say to me in telecasting school, we were sitting in this television studio, and there's all this equipment there, and these huge soundboards and switchers and stuff with buttons and things everywhere. And I swear to God, this actually happened. He said, someone's going to sit you down at a piece of equipment like this in the not too distant future. And whether or not you get paid, you can eat and have an apartment, depends on the answer to the question when they look at you and say, "Do you know how to operate this thing?" And regardless of the real answer, you will always say, yeah, I know exactly what I'm doing. And as soon as he leaves, figure it out. And, there's something to that, but then there's something to that,
That's how you climb the ladder,
there's good
man.
and there's bad. Right, sure. But it's also how you can get yourself into a really deep hole real fast. Because, what if you really are clueless and you just really can't figure it out? And now you got to lie a little bit more just to maybe buy some more time. And that leads to another lie. Do you see what I'm saying? And then all of a sudden you become a sitcom.
Yeah.
And that's
I've always had this idea that I call it constructive ignorance. Right. And so what I would do, and I do this a lot, especially when I'm doing research and talking to people, is I'll say, yeah, but I'd like you to show me how, because sometimes I'll pick up something new that I didn't have before. Right. I know how to use it, but show me how, and then maybe I'll learn something and I'll be better at it. Or maybe I can teach you something.
Clever girl.
And so you then say that because we don't understand something, we're egregiously labeled as something, whether it's a bleeding heart liberal or a Bible thumping conservative. And I think that's a kind of an interesting insight, because it goes to the whole like in-group, out-group thing, right? So like the worst thing in the world is to be labeled as a liberal, right? And so to be labeled as a liberal, to avoid that, I'm not even going to question. I'm not even going to ask the question like, hey, is this the right thing to do? Is this moral? Because that might put me at risk of being labeled in the out group, right? And that to me just seems like such like that's the mindset of somebody who lives in a totalitarian society. I mean, that's like the North Korean mindset, like if I even question something, then that's treasonous.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And where this came from for me was years ago, I asked a question earnestly, and it was something about like modern day race relations. And I remember it was dealing with the African American community, and I had asked something in earnest because I just really didn't know. Like I was totally uninformed. And and somebody basically called me, like a right-wing Christian conservative, like a racist or something, and I just felt really hurt by that sentiment. I'm like, no, I'm really uninformed. Like, I'm sorry. I'm just dumb. I'm trying to really gain some insight. And it's happened on the other side too, where I've asked a question about something and it's immediately taken as if I'm demeaning the mindset of, the ultra conservative or something. And it's like, no, I just don't know. I'm asking you because I want to know. And they're like, oh, you don't know. You must have a motive for not knowing. You're asking a question to point out an inconsistency in our argument, and you're a liberal. It's really hard.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, that's where I come across with this honesty. It's like, can we just be honest and say I don't know, and ask questions?
I think it's interesting because then you go right into the idea of condescension, and that the word condescend doesn't mean what you think it means, or what we all today in modern society agree it means, and that originally it meant on the level is to condescend, to everyone descends
or descend to descend
right.
together. Yeah,
right. And so that's amazing to me, right? And it speaks to exactly what you're saying there, is that, like, don't assume that I'm asking these questions in some sort of prosecutorial manner. It's because I really honestly just want to know the answers to them, and if it seems like I'm digging, I am digging,
Yeah, I'm like, literally, I'm asking
I'm trying
you
to figure this out.
I'm ignorant of the concept. I don't want to be ignorant of the concept.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know so that I can care and that I can love you more. That's what I want.
Yeah.
And so it's frustrating, when it's not seen for what it is. But maybe it's just not seen for what it is because it's rare.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare to care,
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's rare to investigate and to try and dig a little deeper and understand somebody else that you don't agree with. I couldn't agree more on that one.
So when you talk, Robert, about strengthening the mind, right? You say we have a general illiteracy of mind, which is only further weakened by an inability or willful ignorance to try to understand better. Where's that coming from?
That's just my own experience. Like, I think probably before 20, I'm a teenager and I know everything. And then I get into the world, and you immediately start finding places that identify with you intrinsically, like thoughts you've had that you've never expressed, but based on your own life bias, you hear somebody like Alex Jones say something and you're like, yeah, and it strengthens like this argument inside of you. And then anybody who comes at you with something different, you're like, no, get out of here with that. Sorry, I hit my mic. You're like Neo, blasting, you're taking care of all the arguments and whatever. And I just feel where that comes from is a place of, I mean, if I'm honest, immaturity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. And ignorance, and in the meaning, and I use that word, meaning uneducated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because more education, right? Well, and the more educated that you are, the more that you learn, actually go out, practice, and learn, the more you realize. And somebody in comments, I apologize. I've been looking at comments a little bit here and there. They're all fantastic.
No, it is. They're great. It's hard when you got 3 people on the show and comments, and you can't like.
I'll try to get there. But somebody on the comments brought up the old Socrates. I know that I know nothing, right? And what's funny about that is that the ultimate irony is that the more you learn, the more you realize how insignificant and small you are, and how little you've actually how little you've actually or how little progress you've actually made towards trying to figure that thing out. Right? Every piece of the map that the fog of war goes away from, you realize, oh my God, it just keeps going. What is wrong? It's like the never-ending Red Dead Redemption 2. It's terrible.
Yeah, my old strategy professor used to talk about how we carve cubes out of fog.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. That's a beautiful.
Isn't that great?
Actually,
perfect little ashlars of fog.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
All right, so Robert, take us through. I think that the real interesting. The whole paper is interesting, but I think the thing that really kind of brought it home for me was you sort of deconstruct this idea of progressive moral science. Can you kind of take us through that?
Sure. So again, the only way I know how to look at the meaning of a word is twofold. It's what it means today, okay. But also we have to know what it means today is to know how to use it today. And we see this all the time with rhetoric surrounding, say, the Second Amendment, when people will say, well, that's not what it meant at that time. It doesn't mean this, it means this. And so we have to look at context. You have to look at other ways the word was used in the period in which it was originally written or began to be used as such. And really, when you just look at, like, you don't have to dig far, just etymology, progressive, etymology, moral, and so on and so forth. Right? And really what you come down to is it tends to mean this idea of a social reform. And that's what I tried to lay out in the paper. I'll pull it up really quick, but millennialfreemason.com, as Nick likes to say. So progressive started in the 1600s, and they used it to describe idealism as it pertains to, like, moving forward.
Let me ask you a quick question. Where do you go to find out how the word was originally used? Like, what's your investigative process to figure out when you're breaking this down?
Well, if I'm an etymologist, then I'm looking for that word and looking comparatively at lots of examples and saying objectively, these all seem to be saying this. This is how this word is meant in this era. And so for this piece, if you just type in the word progressive and etymology, you'll pull up an etymology dictionary and it'll give you largely the definitions that I laid out in the article. But it's interesting because, like, for instance, when we say progressive moral science, most of the time dudes are always like, no, that just means that it's progressive in terms of moving from first degree, second degree, third degree, like the forward progress. I'm like, well, that's a modern interpretation of the word progress. And you need to look at how that word was used when we originally wrote those words. Like you mentioned, condescension. It's negative today, but it doesn't mean anything negative truly. This is just the modern day societal norm, the way society uses it today, which is not wrong, right? They add words to a dictionary every year. The subjective reality, or the construct of society today decides what's right or wrong. It's the same with money, right? We decide money has value because we decide to all say okay with that, and it's the same with words.
Yeah, and just to kind of put a fine point on it, when you talk about progress, right? Gress is to move, right? Like if you're ingressing, you're coming in, you're moving in. If you're egressing, you're moving out. And if you're progressing, you're moving forward, right? And so whether that's moving forward in terms of a line, I mean, I put it this way, I doubt that it was all that progressive. I mean, put it this way, the third degree was itself somewhat of an innovation, when, back in the day.
It's 100% an innovation, and not even the first innovation.
That's right.
Right. So there, so I would totally agree with you. What about moral? Like what's your
Right on. So moral comes from 1400s is when originally we see that, but we see it used to describe behaviors. And then what we look at is around the time the degrees were, really started to be written and codified in terms of like a ritual and the standard use across, lands and jurisdictions, what have you. There's examples in 1752, it's relatively close to when many people would consider Freemasonry starting, quote unquote, 1721, 1717, or whatever you want to say. But in that time, we see the word moral describing principles, good conduct, things of that nature. And then when we see, okay, good nature, conduct, added to a progressive, so it can't mean, like, I feel like just knowing where the word moral comes from further backs up that the word progressive means forward thinking, a new way of doing something, enacting a system that is based on idealism, a philosophy, how to do something. And we see examples of this again, around the time of the Revolutionary War. You've got guys like Sam Adams or all these other people who did this stuff. I just use him as a popular example. Or even in French society, when we see the exit of religion from their society, which is really one could make the argument that the Grand Orient takes the Bible off the altar because they want to be more aligned with the state in terms of, now after this revolution, we're taking religion out of this context. We should rely on the idealism or the rights of man, and it's the progressive moral science. Whether or not the original intent was there, again, I don't think the original intent of Freemasonry is the progressive moral science. I mean, originally, I think it was just trade guilds. Then I think we get influenced by the Enlightenment and Renaissance. And then I think that's where we make this switch, where men of character started to think about these Enlightenment and ideas and the rights of people. And this is where they start pushing for these things.
You mean they start speculating?
They start speculating.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so maybe that's not what we are today, but it certainly was the last great thing that we cling to. And if we're going to continue to use the verbiage, we should probably put our money where our mouth is.
Okay, let's go to the last word, which is science. So tell me about science.
Science is always, almost from the beginning, means the same thing. It's just knowledge, the application of knowledge and learning. So it's real simple. It's a science or the application of, moving forward through a system of ideologies.
Aha, I gotcha. No, but let me build on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Because I remember being in a philosophy class once and talking about Descartes and his first philosophies, right? And what Descartes was trying to do was his whole thought experiment, where he got the "I think, therefore I am" kind of a thing, where what he got from that was, what he was trying to do in a big way was he tried to sequester himself off to go and think, and just think about one thing, and that's discarding everything that he's ever known or learned. What things then could he say with certainty were true, no matter what, that were absolute fact, truth for everybody, no matter what. It's a truth. And he had a really, really hard time digging himself out of the hole that he creates for himself, right? Philosophically. And his goal actually was science, because science to him, what that meant to him was it was a pursuit of truth, of ultimate truth, regardless of religion, regardless of belief. It was a truth. He could prove it, and it was always that way for everyone, regardless of anything. And that's a tall order when you really, really sit and think about it and meditate on it.
So I'm gonna go a step further, and I'm gonna say that science, the difference between science and other forms of knowledge, is that science is based on observable evidence and reason, right? And so, like, to be a science, right, you have to, like, the idea of divine revelation, right, doesn't enter into science, because it's not, you can't observe it, and you can't, right, it's not repeatable, and you can't, right, it's not something that you can, it transcends reason, right? Now, isn't it an acceptable form of truth? Well, it can be, but it's not science, right?
Right.
So the idea of a progressive moral science is a system of thinking that advances humankind forward, right? That is moral in its nature, and it's based on principles that are transcendent of religion and culture and norms and things like that. It's based on what we can observe, what evidence can we point to, and how we can reason, right? And that's what makes a progressive moral science exactly that.
Yep, coming together to say what affects you, and how is that positive or negative for you, and how does that affect me? Is it positive or negative for me? And ultimately, we have to say that we have to base this on how we feel, and honest feelings, and to say this negatively impacts my feelings, this negatively impacts your feelings, and obviously it seems to impact negatively everybody's feelings. This must be bad.
Right. So Jeff Dyer in the comments, he says Aristotle observed, reasoned, and was wrong a lot of the time. And that's true, right? But the thing about Aristotle is that, and this is the thing about the science, it's in the debate, it's in the discussion where he can say, oh yeah, I was probably wrong about that, right? And start to change the way that we think about things based on new evidence and new reasoning, right? Is that it's like Aristotle had the moral science part. What he didn't have was the progressive part. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that so I guess my question now then is that knowing what we know, having a definition of progressive moral science, is Freemasonry today a progressive moral science?
Spoiler alert.
No. No. Well, that's what I kind of argue is
that's hard. That's a hard thing to say.
Yeah.
We can't be by definition,
right,
because we have the problem of essentially that government takes on the position of what I would identify as a social reform. And so to at all suggest some sort of societal referendum or reformation of sorts, to concern yourself at all with the plight of the woman, in the modern society, or to voice an opinion on anything, to say Black Lives Matter in a lodge, you can't do that. And in my case, I would say until you can say Black Lives Matter in a lodge, You can't call yourself a progressive moral science. And I know there's a lot of guys out there who are going to say like, I'm whatever, I'm a, whatever you want to call me for saying that. But I just feel like whether you agree with that, whether I agree with that, it shouldn't matter. The fact is, if you are concerned with the community at large, if you are concerned with humanity and how somebody is treated, to address a certain problem, whatever it is, whether that's work safety, whether that's, again, whatever you can think of, if you want to address that, we should be able to talk about that and to think about ways we can positively do that. And guys are very quick to say, we do that after the meeting, that's where we do that. I go to the meeting to escape. And my question is like, to escape? Yeah. This is supposed to be TV? Work. This is to work. Like, I go to lodge to work, man, to work on me.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the number one thing that I'm addicted to. If I have employers hate the idea of spinning a weakness into something positive, right? But if I have one of my greatest things that I really love is hearing the perceptions of other people and how they feel. I got a lot of flack once for saying something like the golden rule is not as great as the platinum rule. And somebody said the platinum rule is to treat people how they want to be treated. And maybe I agree with that to an extent. Maybe I don't. There's a middle ground, I think, for sure. But what I feel is important is to at least care how somebody else feels and to know. And I feel like to do that, then it's more of that unified, I don't know, like foundational level of masonry for me. I feel like I should care. We're lodge brothers. So when we say in ritual something like, I should really care about you, rejoice in your joys and cry with you in times of sadness. And I want to know when you got a promotion at work. Mm-hmm. And I want to call you and say, dude, that is so awesome. Congratulations. I am so happy for you. I want to know when, you got $20 in your bank account so I can go, dude, can I take you out to lunch or can I pick you up some groceries or something? Like that's how close we should be, I think. It's not just, Little Caesar's pizza on a Friday night.
I think it needs to be more than that. Like, I think, I use the issue of healthcare, right? Mm-hmm. Because with healthcare, there's a moral component to it, right? Hospitals started out as religious institutions that were there to house and heal the sick, right? And we had, the fact that if you show up, with blood gushing from your head at an emergency room, they have a moral obligation to assist you, right? Whether or not you can pay for it, or not. If we didn't have that moral stance on it, we would just kick people to the street. We'd say, you know what? Oh, sorry, you have no money. Get out,
Right.
And that was 200 years ago, that was a viable thing, right? Like, you couldn't afford to pay a doctor, you couldn't get treatment.
Absolutely.
Right. And so Masons, I think, sort of thinking abstractly about this, what Masons did is they said, we're taught that to heal the sick, and to comfort the sick is a moral directive for us. So we're going to open up hospitals.
To relieve men is a duty, mm-hmm. or to relieve the distress is a duty incumbent upon all men, and especially Masons.
Yeah. So how do we do that, right? Well, one way we could do it is socialized medicine. Well, that's then that becomes a political question, right? How best to do that for everybody. Mm-hmm. But to discuss the morality of healing the sick, and to say, like for Masonry to come out and say something like, we think that the ability get healing and to be treated for illness is a right, that everybody should have that right. Now, how you then execute that right and how you fulfill that right, that's a political question, and we don't necessarily need to debate that in Lodge. But we can debate whether morality demands of us that is healing the sick, is receiving care for medical concerns, is that a right that people have or not? Is education a right? Right? Those are things that are moral issues that I think are within the purview of the fraternity to discuss. And I think the problem that we get into, and this is kind of the wrap up, we're kind of segue into relevancy. The problem is that we're so stressed in terms of afraid to lose members, and we're so concerned with alienating people that we're not going to address those things because they're too hot button of an issue. Well, at what point do you draw the line and just say, you can't be all things to all people, right? You just can't, right? You're going to be nothing to nobody.
Well, this is, Eric, you're diving into something right now that is really difficult for. It's the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk.
Right.
We have the second you say what you're going to say or what you're going to argue here, you are going to be labeled as being unbrotherly.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are those out there who just can't handle this idea of be quiet and shut up for everybody.
I think that the idea of be quiet and shut up doesn't help anybody.
I agree, and I think I want to read this because I'm pretty sure some of our listeners haven't read the piece, and I think probably the most gut wrenching couple sentences in your piece are this, and this talks about kind of where we were, which is. It's my contention to assert a very real revelation directly that by the exercise of removing our right to discuss politics or religion within a lodge, we've effectively neutered our ability to practice the royal art within the context of our original stated purpose, abandoning our tradition without even realizing it. On one hand, we vehemently oppose changes to anything, and on the other, we stand ignorant of what's changed already and accepting of the limitations we put on ourselves.
Ouch.
So, and let me say this: your use of language, Robert, in this whole thing is so good because it's surgical use of language, and you can tell that you thought long and hard about exactly what you wanted to say with this piece, and I think you did.
I have to give credit really well. I have two dudes that I ran this by, and one of them shredded me the first edition. So he's amazing.
Good. That's awesome.
But I have to say that the issue with that last bit is that, again, if we can't have those conversations, we can't practice the royal art, which is the progressive moral science. Mm-hmm. So we're saying, nope, we're a fraternity. We practice these things. That's why we focus on all this other stuff. Don't worry about all this over here because it's divisive. But then at the same time, I talk about, you can't change anything, but we don't even care about what's already changed. What does it take, 20 or 30 years for you to forget that we changed it and it hasn't always been that way? I don't even know what it was. I just read a piece for tonight's episode of Whence Came You. Ira Gilbert wrote this piece about the Holocaust and Freemasonry, and he makes a big point in this thing about how lodges for a long time were anti-Semitic and didn't allow men of the Jewish faith. It was a big deal. It was a huge upset to let a Jew come into a lodge and be initiated.
Yeah, and in Germany, they were super proud of that when the Nazis came around. They were like, hey, we don't let them in. We're awesome, right? Let's be friends. We can work on this together.
And the problem, right, is to look at that and we celebrate how much we've grown because we let Jews into the fraternity now. It's not even a big issue. It's no issue. Nobody cares, seemingly. Okay, so how about the same dialogue that we hear today when we raise any change is the same kind of rhetoric used back then, but now we look back then and we say, yeah, that's pretty Stone Age. That's pretty Stone Age thinking, right? And so my question is, why don't we apply that same lens on ourselves today? Why don't we look at ourselves today and look at ourselves and say, gosh, are we doing the right thing? Is this the right viewpoint? We just feel like we've always got it right. We're always doing the right thing. Mankind is forever living in the now and doing the right thing right now. Until 20 years goes by and we go, boy, did we have that wrong?
Yeah, and I have to tell you, like in my professional life, right? So one of the things that I'm looking at, that I'm working on, is sort of an exploration of, what's next for brands, right? What's happening with brands? What's next for brands? And one of the things that is most important when you look at the technologies, when you look at like AI, for example, when you look at data, when you look at, the fact that we can observe directly behaviors that 20 years ago we were just guessing. And that's relevance. Relevance is the new thing that all these brands are jumping on, because young people of today vote, they don't. It used to be that we identified ourselves by our communities, by the the fraternities we were a member of, by the churches we were a member of. But young people today, they're not joining those kinds of organizations. So how are they expressing their affiliation? How are they expressing their values to other people? How are they signaling those things? Well, they do it by consuming brands, right? And brands know this. So, and we talked about this a few episodes ago. We talked about Gillette and what, Gillette had made that thing about toxic masculinity, and we talked about that. Nike came out with a Colin Kaepernick ad, right? And did it alienate people? Sure, absolutely. There were lots of people who, very publicly took to YouTube to burn their Nikes, right? But by taking a stand, right? Yes, did they lose people? They did, but they also gained a lot more, right? Because they took a stand. People now say, by wearing Nikes, I'm expressing myself as someone who supports this line of thinking and this point of view. And brands, big brands, are falling all over themselves. Chanel, right? Chanel used to be this thing about, luxury French couture. Now it's a female empowerment brand, right? It's a school in how to be a strong woman who doesn't have to shirk her commitment to her beauty, right? Brands like Adidas have completely reinvented themselves from being this, sneaker for athletes to being this statement about culture and creativity, right? And so by Apple is another example of a brand that, just sort of says, we are here to creatively empower people, right? And so by taking that stand and by expressing that kind of morality, they are attracting a certain type of person, right? And yes, are they alienating other types? Sure, they are. But that's why we have multiple brands for things, right? Mm-hmm. And so the thing is like, my feeling is that in this day and age, as we're trying to attract people, right? People are not going to be attracted to any sort of organization or pursuit or commitment or investment of time unless they are aligned to what the beliefs of the organization are. Yeah. And if you don't have beliefs as an organization, you better get them. You better figure it out.
I just want to. This just goes back a little bit because on Facebook they're about 10 seconds behind time than we are. But this is an excellent point by Jeff Woolsey. Who decides what equals open-minded? Not everyone will define it in the same way. Being open-minded needs to be taught. It needs to be modeled for people. I have to do it every single day as a school teacher. Do they learn the first time, the second time, or even the 10th time? No, but eventually they may. It's such a good point. That is what we need to be doing in our lodges. Is part of our part of the process of a progressive moral science is by teaching each other, and it's by lifting each other up, so that we all can condescend with each other, right?
Right.
Because
and what's super important, just to that point, is to be able to. This is where the brotherhood element for me really comes into play. Is that as we're learning together, we can ask questions. I'm going to use the term, even though I hate it, in a male safe environment, right? We can,
right,
because we don't want to admit that we're wrong in front of a lady or somebody else that we're interested in.
right.
So it's about not being in an echo chamber too. Like I had one of my mentors told me, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong effing room, and it's like, yeah, because I don't want to go in there and be you've seen brain candy, Kids in the Hall, right? Red sneaker dude. Like everybody's just like, oh yes sir, right away. So everything is whatever that guy wants, regardless if it's wrong or not. It's an echo chamber for him, and he's not doing anything. He's not learning, right? And if we're a progressive moral science, we want to learn, we want to be together. I think that's where that brotherhood comes in to play. You mentioned this idea of alienating customers, and like to take you back to something you said earlier in the episode, Eric. You said something about like basically destroying a paradigm for somebody and alienating them with the member. Like it's kind of the same thing. If we were to align, if we were to make a brand statement of Freemasonry, which I think they're trying to do in an awfully opaque way, could we then get some of those customers, quote unquote? You'll remember that same Grand Master who issued statements regarding homosexuality and Freemasonry. Several states issued statements. Recognitions were pulled. It was very interesting to see the comments coming from, I think DC was the first who was like, hey, it's about moral character, not sexual preference. And that was a statement. That was a brand statement, I felt. But because Grand Lodges are also autonomous, it's a brand statement for Masonry in this state or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and California, California was put in a really, really ugly situation, because if they didn't come out and say something against it, there are laws in California that basically say you cannot discriminate, and if they didn't say something, it would make them vulnerable to government interference, right?
And that's what I hated, Eric. I hated the fact, though, that when I was like, good for California, and I said something like that, somebody was like, well, it was just because they had legal obligation to do so. They really, are you implying that they don't or wouldn't otherwise? It's the same that happened over in UGLE when they issued the statement via trans. For anybody who's gone through post or pre-op or however that works. But I don't mean to say however it works and I don't care. I do. But they said they had a legal obligation to do that, and it wasn't necessarily from a place of societal reform or whatever. And that may be true, but I choose to believe that as ardent and as what's the word I want to use? Stickler. Anyway, as much as we are right now in our fraternity, nobody can tell us anything. I have to say that if we disagreed with that statement, I'm fairly certain we would have heard a lot more grumblings from, Grand Masters or whoever. Oh, we have to. You bet your bottom dollar it would have been in the statement. We shouldn't have to do this, but legally we do. They would say that.
Well, I think it's cover. I think it's a smokescreen because if they come out and just say it as a statement of principles, they risk alienating other people inside their lodge. So by saying, well, we had a legal obligation, we're protecting ourselves from legal liability, it gives them cover. It allows them to do that, which is sort of the symptom of the problem. And here's the test. So, Jason, I'm going to use you as my guinea pig. Okay. Right? Would you say that tolerance of alternative religion is a core Masonic value?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we were relevant, what you would have seen is Grand Lodges around the world throwing in support of the New Zealand shooting that just happened, the terrible tragedy, right, where Muslims were gunned down. And the fraternity has been utterly silent on it. And so that just tells me that either we don't see that as our place to comment, right? I mean, to me, that it's call me crazy, call me unmasonic, but to me, that's a moral issue. That is a moral issue to say, you know what, we shouldn't be killing each other over our religion.
Well, okay, yeah, it is. I think just from the Grand Lodge perspective, putting that hat on for a minute.
They wear hats?
Yeah, it's improper. It's improper, I think, for us in this situation. Now, I think by saying that, it puts me a little bit in a box because now that I think back on it, why didn't we do something for the major American mass shootings that happen every other month, and treat those just like we do a natural disaster, right? A hurricane blows through and kills a few people, and MSA is wham on the scene. Let's help our brethren out, give some money, we'll send it to the Grand Lodge, they can then direct it to the locals who are in need. And we haven't done that.
That's because a hurricane doesn't have a political alignment.
It doesn't have a point of view.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Sure.
Should
that matter though? But does that matter? That's what I'm getting at. Because
I don't think it does.
I think in a way, that means that my obligation to help you from the hurricane is a little bit less, because I want to combat the evil, right? Because I think we can all agree, mass shooters are evil. So we.
I'm sorry,
as a
I'm sorry,
fraternity,
Jason. You lost me when you strictly identified somebody as a shooter.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. I'm playing devil's advocate here because you're gonna get people who
totally.
literally say that to you.
Yeah, totally.
You're gonna lose.
Sure. Any person who kills someone in a mass fashion is evil, and the thing is that like. How we don't go and combat that as a fraternity when we profess that we're here making good men better, and we give all that money to hurricane stuff, and the hurricane didn't have a point of view. It wasn't evil, it just was. It's nature, and we're there to combat that. I think that makes it worse.
Well, we're not. So let me just sort of split some hairs here. We're not condemning hurricanes, right? Right. What we're saying is we have an obligation as a moral fraternity to aid the suffering, right? So we're gonna go out and give money and help out, and we do that.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Maybe not as much as we'd like to, but we do what we can do, and so that's kind of a no-brainer. But I think. You don't have to look. You can say it is morally wrong. We are a moral fraternity, and we think it's morally wrong to kill people because of their religious beliefs. Full stop. Right? Now, whether you support Islamic extremism or not, or whatever that is, it doesn't matter. Christian extremism, it doesn't. None of that stuff matters. What matters is it is morally wrong to kill people for their religious beliefs. Full stop. We condemn this. Mm-hmm. How difficult would it be to say that? How controversial would that be just to say, you know what? Our hearts are with those people in New Zealand. We think it's terrible. You know, if we're able to help the suffering, we're here to help the suffering. How can you be against that? Like, it just, to me, it's like it's unfathomable, right? And so, but the thing is like, and I understand why a Grand Lodge would be reluctant to make a statement like that, right? Oh, it's not our place, right? It's, you know, it might be seen as controversial. There might be people in the fraternity who are, you know, secretly rejoicing over this. You know, right? They'll just say it's not our job. It's not you know, within us. That's for individuals who are in the Masonic fraternity to do that. Okay, well, that's great. Well, that means that, you know, Jason, Robert, you guys are good guys and I want to hang out with you, but it doesn't mean that I want to become a Mason, right? That doesn't mean that that the fraternity itself, and that the reason that you guys are like that, you guys are moral people, is because of Freemasonry, because there's no evidence. There's nothing in the culture to support that. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. Sure. To further your point, or maybe to just add on to it, it's interesting to say, like, maybe we would say something like that if we had our finger on the pulse of the world. Mm-hmm. You know? And to have your finger on the pulse is essentially, you know, equitable to say it is being relevant. But I have to say, you know, when you initially asked that question, Eric, I just was like, instantly I go to a place of like, crap. Yeah, hey, if I'm the Grand Master of the United States, we issue a statement. Yeah, for sure. But also, I'll jump back to, I don't know, maybe like the 2/4 area of the paper when I said something along the lines of, you know, immediately identifying ourselves based on a singular idea that you support, and to singularly, and to say something like, we stand in solidarity with New Zealand. And the tragedy that's happened there, this terrorist attack, which was, I don't think they've said it's a terrorist attack yet, but I think the media has labeled it as such correctly, is an act of, you know, Christian terrorism.
It's terrorism.
What it seems like.
It was a calculated act inflicted on a community to impose terror.
And I said Christian terrorism, and maybe it's not. What I will say what it is that person was very much aligned with that religious belief. And so it took his extremism that way. And so that's why I use that qualifier. If that offended somebody, I do apologize, but that's just what it feels like and how it reads to me. And to look at that and say, why can't we say it's wrong? I mean, that's a really hard question, Eric. I think
I agree.
It would be interested to field that, you know. I just think that there's nothing lost in if we truly believe that a man's religion should not matter and should not disqualify him from Freemasonry, right? Then that extends to being able to say we condemn anybody who kills anybody over religion. It's just it's to us we say it's immoral.
I mean, like I said, I mean, I think that with New Zealand, it's the other side of the planet, right? And so that can give us kind of an excuse. It gives us a little bit of an out. But then you think back and you go, well, but that just happened in Pittsburgh. Not as many people dead, but same kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think it just happened in Brazil too.
Yeah, it did.
I think Brazil just had like 40 kids, like all under the age of 10, gunned down.
Yep. Right. Yeah.
Or was it Rio? I don't know. Shame on me.
I mean, Masonry was founded in an era when men were killing each other over what church they attended. right? And when they finally got tired of killing each other, they said, "Hey, you know what? I think we have a better way of doing this,
dealing with it."
Right?
Well, here's some additional evidence, and granted, it doesn't go back to the original founding 1300s ancient charge stuff. Alnwick manuscript is probably one of my favorites, written I think in the 1740s. Has just about the most progressive thing I think I've ever effing read in terms of Freemasonry, and it says something along the lines of. It lists all the ancient charges. It says you can't be a Freemason unless you've taken communion in the last year. Oh, well, communion is a Christian thing. Okay, so it's a Christian organization. Yada, 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 all the way at the bottom. Paraphrasing, these will be the charges of a Freemason, blah, 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 until such time that they're reevaluated and we figure out a better way. And I thought, holy cow. Did they just admit that they might not be right?
And that things might change in the future?
You can't do that today. I don't know what. There is not one, and maybe it's just. I want to say, I hope I don't catch any flack for this, but I don't know of a single grand jurisdiction that will ever, regardless, admit a fault.
That's a fact.
Yeah, probably. But I don't know. I think that until we're able to do that, until we're able to just some really basic stuff and stuff that look, it doesn't have to be stuff that is we don't have to weigh in on data privacy and our AI is going to all replace our jobs and stuff like that. That's not. There's nothing in our tradition, in our legend, in our liturgy, in our any of that stuff that speaks to any of that. But there are things that do, right? About equality of people and being on the level and the idea of being moral. There are things that we can say that basically so that when the average person sees the Masonic ring, they know what you stand for. They know what you're about. It's a signal that says to the world, oh, this is what this guy's about, and not just my grandfather was one of those. That's
Eric.
Right.
That's a romanticized idea, though. People are they always tell this story I became a Mason because when I saw that ring, I just knew. No, you didn't. And I'm not saying everybody out there, right? But before I researched, back in the day before I became a Mason, I was just really into occult studies. And before I researched that and what Masons were about, I didn't know they were good dudes. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like if we want somebody to see the ring and know, well, then we need to be relevant.
Exactly.
But let me ask you a question, Eric, because you're a brand expert. How does Masonry what could we do now to become relevant? And maybe a side question. I don't want to put you on the spot. If you don't want to answer, it's fine. How are we doing in the Northern jurisdiction with this not just demand campaign? Is that enough? Is it on the right track?
Oh my God, that's a whole nother episode.
All right, so let me start with the first part of your question, which is it, what can we do, right? I think the first thing that we can do is start to have discussions and start to draft kind of a statement of purpose. And it ain't to make good men better, right? That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't tell you anything, right? So the first thing is to be clear on what our purpose in the world is as a progressive moral science and what that means. So I think we have a lot of navel gazing to do. We have a lot of soul searching to do, and a lot of discussion amongst ourselves to find out what are those core things that are baked into our DNA, right? And those are going to be a lot of really interesting questions, right? And it may be a slightly different for any grand jurisdiction, but those discussions need to be had. at that level. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we should be engaged with the outside world, and not just with our local communities and doing charity work, right? We have to make it really clear who we are and what we are, so that people understand, like, this is what Masonry is and here's what it isn't. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to attract anybody significant. And that show that you guys did a couple weeks ago with Lance Kennedy about how we're, like John Rourke was saying that, like, at the rate we're declining, it's like, what is it, 2040 or 2060, we hit zero, right? We'll continue that path. Maybe not, maybe the curve will flatten out a little bit, maybe it won't, but we're going to continue to decline if we can't articulate who we are and what we are, if we don't have that elevator pitch. And then in terms of the northern jurisdiction, I actually think what they're doing is great stuff. I mean, I really, and look, I'm a guy, I kind of had a bad experience in the Scottish Rite. I have every reason to, like, want to be like, oh, the Scottish Rite is completely irrelevant and blah, blah, blah. But I got to say, what they've been doing, their commitment to education, their commitment to making these materials available, is a great first step. It's not enough. It's a great first step. At least what they're saying is we need to get out of our own lodge rooms and out of our own heads and realize that there's a world out there that needs to be informed about what we are. Because if we don't control that conversation, it will be controlled for us. Make no mistake.
Let me add a little something to that too. Is that I hate their copy. I don't like the ads. I don't like the copy. I don't like any of that stuff. But they tried, and I love that they tried, because that's the first step. And what we were talking about in the very beginning of the show, this relates to, and that's that they put their foot out. They put their foot forward, and they tried to make a movement. And I love them forever and ever for doing that, because, they're not afraid to be wrong. They're trying to push it forward. And part of that whole I don't ask for directions when I'm lost thing is because you're afraid to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. And in fact, it's really, really helpful so that you can take the next step and the next step. And that's where I'm waiting for, is I'm waiting for the next step. I want them to improve this. I want them to move this forward somehow. And I think that's great.
Yeah, I think the videos are cool. I think I've caught myself identified. I was like, oh yeah, I feel that. That's nice. Mm-hmm. But it's like, I almost feel like the next relevant step for me is like, is it the next, like, is like Johnny Ives going to come on? Is he be like, well,
right. Yeah.
We took the sleekest design, like, of what it means to be a man.
Right.
Or is it going to be like, Steve Jobs? Are we gonna get Glatley walking on stage, which I would watch, and going, what's next?
Yeah, sure.
Hout grade S.
Right.
Like, and everybody like applauds. It's like, we do need to have, like, they're doing the webcasts and stuff, and I think it's so important, because at least they're being relevant in the way people are consuming the information.
Totally.
100%.
I applaud it. Yeah. I mean, I think the days of like giving someone a 3-inch thick copy of Morals and Dogma and going, job's done, like, those days are over, because people don't read, right? People don't read. And that's sad. It's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. And so if you're not willing to, put it this way, we're all podcasters, right? We're reaching people, talking about Masonry, right? Because if we put out a magazine, quite frankly, no one would be reading it, right?
Trust me, I know.
Right? So, ouch. Sorry, Jason.
He looks at his MailChimp subscriber click opens.
So as far as the NMJ is concerned, I 150% support. In fact, you know, I've I'm going to out myself here. I've allowed myself to go NPD several years, and I'm back as a dues paying member, even though I don't really attend Scottish Rite events because I mean they're too far away right now. But I support. I mean, this is a classic example. Like, this is the millennial mindset in action, right? Yeah. I support what they're doing.
There you go.
And I want to vote with my affiliation, with my membership, and with my dollars, right? And so I'm willing to support them, even though it doesn't have a huge direct effect on me. I don't go to the golf outing. I don't, you know, I don't really have the ability to attend the agrees, but dang it, I support what they're doing, and I want them to continue it. So I'm going to vote with my dollars and with my affiliation.
I did the same thing. I demitted in good standing, and I got a letter that's saying, okay, you're demitted, you're all good. Then I watched the first webcast that Gladly did, and he said a couple things that were really important to me, and I won't go into those right now, but those two things he said, I was like, all right. I called up my Valley. I said, what do you need? And they said, just send a letter back. I was already still paid in. I said, okay. I was only out for like 6 months, and I've since paid my dues and continuing. And it's because the same reason. I vote, like, I will support you provided you are doing what I view is the right thing.
Yeah. And I want to get me some of that Haute Grade love too.
Haute Grade S.
That's what
I need.
That's my next thing. Is I want to delve into
XS.
that.
Yes.
Tight.
Love it.
XS Max. Well, this is, you guys, this has been a great show. We're almost hitting 2 hours, which might be a record. We may have to split this episode into 2 parts, but I think it was an important conversation to have. And Robert, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts?
I was coming on this show ready to be slaughtered, really. You two gentlemen are forever breaking down some serious barriers and going into some uncomfortable places. But also I recognize how serious that is, and the fact that it's this serious. A very close friend of mine, whether he realizes it or not, a mentor, said, it's precisely I took Masonry this seriously that I left.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means to me is like so deep the way I deconstructed that. And so these conversations that are difficult to have are a must if we take Masonry seriously. So just a big thanks for what you guys do in putting this out, and for having me on. It's a real honor to be, on this particular program. When I first started in Masonry, the podcast I listened to is Scott Blaskin's Digital Freemason, and I said something about it, and Paul Sheeler, the Valley of Chicago, said, he said, you heard Eric Diamond's podcast? I was like, who's Eric Diamond? He's like, X-Oriente. I checked it out, and I was like, mind blown. Holy cow. So just thrilled to be here and be able to talk with you gentles.
Thanks.
Thanks
Jason, any final thoughts?
No, first of all, this is a fantastic topic and an incredible conversation. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think, Robert, your piece of work, I said it before and I'll say it again, it just truly was so well thought through. And I think that you took a lot of care with it. And it shows in the writing. And I think it's terrific. And it's exactly the kind of thing that everybody needs to read and hear and understand.
With an open mind.
Yeah, because it is a great prescription for curing what ails Masonry today. Love it. So thank you very much, and thanks for being here with us and talking about it.
Cool. Anything you want to shamelessly plug?
Podcast comes out in 16 minutes every Sunday, 9:30. Whence came you? Yeah.
Excellent. Do you do it live, or do you record it and then release?
Record. I write the show. I put it all together, my show notes and everything on Wednesday. Record on Thursday, and master and upload on Friday. Some days, though, we all know how that goes. I did it all this morning.
Wow.
So it was
Damn.
rough.
Wow.
Not enough coffee.
Cool. All right. Well, this is the point in the show where we thank our executive producers. Without you guys, this show doesn't happen. And so if you'd like to support us, you can go to our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/X-Oriente. Right now, we've got a new program that we just started with the last episode called Ex Libris, where we have an esoteric library of over 2,400 volumes that we are slowly releasing, and it's only available to the executive producers. Those files are released on Patreon. We've got about 8 of them up now, and we'll be releasing 3 more this week. And we're going to try to make them good ones. I think one of them is going to be the Blue Equinox, which is a bit of Crowleyana.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so those go up, and so if you'd like to have
Get the
access
horns
to,
ready.
that's right, get the horns ready. So if you'd like to have access to that library, then by all means do that. And then we're going to be doing some shorter live, more informal get-togethers again for the executive producers. We're still trying to work out the logistics and the tech and stuff like that, figure out how to do it in the right way. But that's coming soon. So again, thank you to our executive producers. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. Drop us a line on Facebook. One of the things that we're going to be thinking about is moving the show wholesale to YouTube. So if this is something that is like, if you guys are on the Facebook audience now, one of the reasons we do this live is because of the participation that we get in the chat room, and in the comments. And so if this is something that you guys can feel like you can do over on YouTube, let me know what your thoughts are. Just drop us a line at xoriente@gmail.com and let us know, or leave a comment on the Facebook page. And we'd love to engage in dialogue with you guys about it. So with that, I will say good night. Thanks for sticking with us. Thank you again, Robert. And thank you to everyone who showed up in the comments. And a special hello to Federico, who is from Argentina. He showed up, and he was I think he was the first person to comment, but I didn't get to say hello. So buenas noches, and I hope you'll join us again. Until then, everybody, Fiat Vox.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.